Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you for attending this talk that I'm giving in the context of the Informs Tutorial 2020, and which happens to be virtual, as we all expect, given the fact that Informs this year is the first ever Informs that is happening virtual due to the known reasons of the pandemic. Before I introduce myself, the talk, I'd like to start by thanking a lot both Vedad El Maghrabi and Cheryl Druel for the opportunity and the invitation to be part of this great effort within the Informs annual meeting context, the Informs tutorials. And at the same time, also a great thanks to Doug Shear for all the great feedback that he's given us into the equivalent chapter of this talk, which is going to be appearing on the Informs Tutorials 2020 volume. My name is Stelios Kavadias. I am at the University of Cambridge at the Judge Business School here. And I will be giving you a talk about innovation, which is a topic that I think it's rich enough to deserve a great overview. And hopefully this talk is going to become part of that overview. So let me share my slides and get to move on with the discussion. So this work is not solo, it's together with a great colleague here at the University of Cambridge at the Judge Business School, Jeremy Hutchison-Krupat, and a great friend. And obviously I'll start by indicating, as always, that all thoughts and ideas are ours. And in that respect, you will find that we might take a little bit of a biased perspective on certain things, as it is expected in those cases, but hopefully it's going to be useful and informative for all of us. So let me start with something that I don't think it requires special motivation, but it might be useful to even set the right context and the right perspective on where all this is coming from. So the importance of innovation. Why is innovation important? I think it's undisputable that innovation, for better or worse, is creating value and it's creating growth in societies. It's creating economic prosperity. Now, this is not simply a statement, right? An observation that we make, but it goes way back to earlier observations that are rooted in the economics science. And primarily, I would like to distinguish two interesting pioneers in that respect. The first one is obviously Joseph Schumpeter, who, as the prophet of innovation, as the equivalent biography that circulates these days calls him, has identified early on the importance, the centrality of innovation for any kind of economic exchange and economic context. So in a sense, and I'm going to read the quote for you, surely nothing can be more plain or even more trite common sense than the proposition that innovation is at the center of practically all the phenomena, difficulties, and problems of economic life. And I think he's not that far out from that. The first, though, that has really put a measurable quantity and identified the significant effect of innovation in economic exchanges and economic life is Robert Solow, with his seminal work back in 1957, which eventually has given him the Nobel Prize for the economic sciences in 1987, who has identified this infamous G factor, or the technical progress augmented labor factor, in his effort to explain growth and what factors were driving growth. Obviously, there were two fundamental options there, right? That growth could be driven by putting more inputs, more capital, more labor, or something else which would take the same amount of inputs, but turn those inputs to become more productive, something that he identified as technical progress. And I think this is the first few stages of really going down the path of understanding what the value of innovation is. So his infamous factor, the G factor, the augmented labor technical progress, as I said before, was identified to be extremely significant. Looking at the growth of the United States economy over a significant period of time, from the 1800s or all the way to 1950, he found that almost 80% of that growth was coming from the technical progress. So there was no question that innovation was important from an economic standpoint. And also, with subsequent work, it was obvious that it was an important factor that was determining how value creation, but also value appropriation was happening. So innovation was a significant factor for many organizations as they were trying to appropriate value from the offerings they had in their respective markets. And there's another seminal work by Philippe Aghion and his co-authors much later than solo, which has indicated that as the competitiveness essentially was increasing in certain markets, the innovation sort of effort was increasing, especially in industries which they call the neck-to-neck firms. There's firms that were very close in terms of performance with each other. Now, this is great. This is putting forward an amazing average effect economically. So we understand that on average, innovation is good. We understand that on average, firms innovate more. But the reality is that when we actually open up the can of worms and we try to look inside the different markets, there are winners and losers in terms of innovation. And in that respect, one of the interesting questions is what is making some of those companies successful and some others failing with respect to innovation, which comes much closer to what I would assume the audience as well as the presenters of this talk might be interested in, right? This operational aspect of how we understand innovation. So in that respect, the objective of the talk is multifold in the following sense. So what we will try to do, and what we've tried to do in the equivalent chapter with Jeremy, is to really offer some answers about what I would call the firm level innovation practices, the operational firm level innovation practices, in terms of first assessing the importance of the definition of innovation. And that's a topic that might sound a priori boring, but I think it's extremely important once somebody takes into account the framing effects that definitions have within organizational context. That's one thing. Second is introducing a core framework, something that we have sort of worked upon in a few years now, and we are using massively across all our courses, executive education programs, and so on and so forth, in an effort to communicate and understand and really support executives in making decisions, operational level decisions with respect to innovation and making innovation happen. And then we're going to look into the literature and examine how the literature that has happened over the past 20, 25 years primarily biased a bit towards the operations management, operations research management sciences literature has supported the understanding that we have in terms of what makes certain innovations much more successful than others, and certain companies being more successful in innovating than others. And finally, we're going to try to assemble all the insights of this literature into a map, into a how-to map. So how do we run innovation in organizations? And we will see there that we will make a distinction in terms of the type of innovation. That's something that's going to be coming up, right? Finally, I think it's only fair to open up a few questions. Again, the questions, as always, will have the caveat that they depend on our perspectives and they depend on what we perceive as important, but maybe by pushing out a few of those thoughts, we will instigate and inspire others to think about those problems. Apart from the broader agenda for the talk, one of the things that I would like to say is that for me, it's a great opportunity to be able to give this talk, because I see this talk also as a vehicle for promoting or for making more known an amount of work that has happened over the last 20, 25 years from a community within operations management, which is the product development innovation community. And hopefully you will realize that there is enough richness, enough depth, and enough interesting contexts to really look into, that we will inspire more of our colleagues on the Inform side to start looking more towards the direction of research on innovation. So hopefully we're going to hit all the objectives as we go forward. So let's start with the first discussion, which is this notion of what is innovation? What are the implications of a definition? And I will start with a very broad definition. And there is a reason why I start with this broad definition, as I will explain later on. So innovation, the way we will treat it in this talk, and in general, I am treating it in most of my research, in a sense, is it's having three key characteristics that are broad characteristics. The first one is it's about something new. It's something novel. There has to be some level of novelty in innovation. The second one is that novelty is not sufficient by itself. So innovation is not about an idea. It's not about an invention, but innovation is about something implementable to the level that there is an actual offering, an actual artifact, not necessarily a product. It can be in the form of a process. It can be in the form of a new rule. It can be in the form of a technological sort of platform, but there's something tangible and implementable that will generate value, which takes us to the third point, which is that innovations have to be economically useful. Now, you will see that in my slide, I have the word economically starred, and there is a reason for that, because that doesn't necessarily imply only short-term economic rents, as the economists would say, in a sense, a transaction that will give us higher profit or higher revenue, but it can be longer and broader economic trends in the sense of social benefits. So innovation can happen as well within governments, and innovation doesn't necessarily imply that we need to lead to profitability. Innovation could imply that we're creating enough economic prosperity, enough social value, while not running into the negative from a cost and an investment standpoint. And that's really why the word economically comes start into this discussion. Now, again, attribution goes back to Schumpeter, who I think is, in the end of the day, the forefather of all this discussion about innovation by highlighting the importance of it. And he sort of puts everything in one sentence by saying that innovation is the successful commercial exploitation of new ideas. I would only change the word commercial, although somebody could interpret the word commercial in multiple aspects. Now, two questions will emerge from this. Let me address them one by one, right? The first question is it important, and why is it important to define innovation broadly? I think the answer here comes from the fact that depending on how we define innovation, we might create framing within the context of an organization. What does this mean? It means that if innovation is only about certain things, if innovation is only defined about particular dimensions, on particular novelty changes, on particular domains within our business, then obviously by using that definition of innovation, we will promote a culture, if you wish, of innovation that will look only towards that direction. What is the result of that? Potentially over-specialization in terms of where we seek to create value, and avoiding to understand that innovation can happen across multiple of the domains and the dimensions of our organizations. So in that respect, one could see that even in practice applying very strongly and creating negative results. Why is that the case? So here's a simple test that I've been doing with many students in the MBA, executive MBA, or even executive education programs that I've been running that relate to innovation. Ask them a simple question. Ask them to name one innovation that they have come across recently. And the majority, I'm not saying that everyone is going to do that, but the majority of the individuals that will respond to your query, they will come back with something like the iPhone or an Apple potentially, or Tesla and Elon Musk and his company Tesla, or the drones and Amazon, or the artificial intelligence used in certain platforms that exist recently. Now, it depends on the time frame where you ask the questions. I happen to be asking that question for a good 2 decades now as a professor. So obviously you can guess in the different periods of time, I'm getting different questions with different highlights. The iPhone in the older days, these days is much more about platforms and the likes. But the inside doesn't necessarily change, right? This implies that this is exactly how we implicitly frame ourselves to think about innovation. And that is where sometimes the problem starts within organizations. So if we promote, celebrate, recognize, award innovation as such, then what we expect to happen, then we will be losing on all the other aspects of innovation that we might be gaining. And this is in problems that are not necessarily technically important, but in outcomes that are bringing even more value. And I have some of the weirdest sort of innovations listed in the slide, that the Neo-Nurture, which was a baby incubator created only with car parts for sub-Saharan Africa, or the fact that at some point in time, Whirlpool has come up with the Gladiator line simply by applying methods and mechanisms for ideation and execution of innovation, which we will talk about later on, and created a line that has given them a return of close to $1 billion, right, as a product line. So all these imply that maybe there's a lot of money left on the table, starting with the framing. Now, here's an interesting thing and an idea for a research paper potential for some who feel audacious enough to pursue that. There hasn't been any rigorous study that has looked into this effect of the definition of innovation and how different companies are generating value out of this. Now, obviously, that has the caveat that I don't know everything, and maybe there has been some study in some place that I've missed in looking, but nothing that is coming striking as one of those studies that is highly quoted. And I think that's an important sort of problem to start with. So back to the definition has to be broad in a sense, in terms of what innovation is, in order to be able then to look much wider for the mechanisms and the processes, the rules, the routines that make this broad aspect of innovation happen. So innovation is beyond technology and products, and it can be about market channels and how we approach the customer and how we create experiences for the customer. It can be about business models, and there's a bit of work that thankfully has started in the last few years. I try to contribute to that stream of work myself as well, or organizational processes. What this highlights, though, is something else important. Once we define innovation in those broader terms from an academic standpoint, we're able to highlight the importance of the management of innovation around it as opposed to the core idea itself. And this is a debate that I've often seen happening between technical departments, more closer to engineering, and business school departments closer to the business. There's the perception that says that in the end of the day, if we have owned the technology, we can start the new companies, we can have the new products. So really, it's the technology that drives the value. I would tend to contest this and say, of course, the technology is an important enabler, but there's another important enabler, which is, can we produce value by taking this idea and making it implementable, creating distinguishable economic value and usefulness for people, and claiming that this is new and therefore people need to come and buy from us or from this idea as opposed to another idea. So the point here, and I'm striking this first point before I switch gears and I get a bit more into the framework that you will see coming about, is that we have to have a bit of a more rigorous assessment on whether the direction of innovation, what we are innovating on, defines, in a sense, the respective ROI. And there is actually a hot off the press item that I didn't include in the chapter because I didn't even know about the paper. It just came out in the articles in Advanced Management Science by Fitzgerald and a couple of other co-authors that tries to look into this distinction between explorative versus exploitative innovation, and I'll come to that at some point, and how this creates more or less value from a stock exchange standpoint. So we need to get to the point of understanding what type of innovation creates more value. Nevertheless, one of the key messages, and that's why I'm having this interesting sort of innovation radar aspect, which was promoted by Sony and Wolcott and Aronis back in 2006, a sort of classic MIT Sloan Management Review article that I use a lot, that really speaks to, let's think outside of the box of our current innovation practices and let's define additional domains where innovation can be happening. So that's sort of a core message. Now, that was the first question, right? Is it important to define innovation? Why is it important to define innovation? Second question is how, since the management of innovation starts becoming extremely important, if we assume that innovation can happen anywhere, so ideas might be there a dime a dozen, so to speak, but we need to be thinking about those ideas from a different sort of way of taking them to be implementable, create the economic value, and all the other elements of our definition. So the second question that emerges is does this breadth matter for the management of innovation? How does this breadth define whether we can find a theory of innovation or we can find a common set of mechanisms? And I think one of the interesting elements which makes the problem a bit more challenging here is that we might not necessarily be able to have a unified hammer that really we can apply to organizations and make them from non-innovative to innovative. We have to be a little bit more contingent thinking oriented, in a sense. And I'll try to sort of qualify this. Now, it's important to identify that there's some key challenges from the definition coming on, because those challenges implicitly will speak directly to whether we need to be thinking about different types of innovation and whether we support those different types of innovation with different mechanisms. The first thing is that by definition, innovation is fraught by risk. So there's a lot of uncertainty, right? It's about something new. And now the question is, depending on how new this new thing is, we will get more or less risk in our effort, which means uncertain payoffs, yet having to commit the cost. So that's a big, big challenge, right? Now, obviously, this creates interesting questions of the type of how much novelty do we want to pursue as a company, what type of uncertainty, is it market, technical uncertainty, short-term uncertainty, longer-term uncertainty, new to the company, new to the world? We don't know. The second one is the fact that by seeking to make innovation implementable, this means that at certain point, we will have to get the input from other functions, other functional experts, other entities, other parties in this process of taking things forward. So it's not enough to have an idea. We will need to actually market that idea. We will need to engineer the product and design. We will need to produce it and manufacture it. So by definition, the implementability and the scale implies that we will have to have a cross-functional, chaotic mechanism to coordinate their effort to coordinate there. And at the same time, the notion of scale will imply that we need to be thinking carefully about the cost-benefit sort of analysis for making this happen. Now, who should be involved? Where should they be involved? At what time and with what communication platforms, and how they should be reporting to each other, and eventually what decisions are made by whom in what elements. This notion of broad governance starts becoming extremely challenging, as you can guess. And we need to be thinking about that. And all this have to be adapting to the key metric of output. Are we looking for something which is going to be produced in huge quantities, more commoditized, so we need to reduce costs? Are we looking at something that needs to be produced at a very high quality, more customized perhaps, which implies that we need to be thinking very carefully about the pricing and the coordination with the costs as well? Do we need to think about time? Do we need to think about speed of delivery? All those elements will have an implication for the structures that we put forward. Last but not least, the economically useful aspect of the definition implies that we need to be thinking about a multidimensional aspect of the performance of innovation, right? And that speaks directly to the challenge of what is the right key metric and output. And primarily we've seen work here, and I can say that relate to profitability, but the reality is that there is explicit discussions, for example, in the entrepreneurial settings, where the performance of the organization that seeks to innovate and bring innovation to market might not be profitability immediately, but for a period of time, it might be survival, or it might be market share, or it might be other metrics that we need to be thinking, speed to market. So there is an ample discussion to be had in terms of how the different dimensions of performance for innovation would actually flow back and determine the ways by which we need to be thinking about conducting innovation. The horizon is also important, short-term versus long-term. Is it about social value or commercial? Are we maximizing the social welfare? Are we maximizing the profitability? These are open questions, and depending on how those questions are put forward, then they will have an implication about the decisions that we make, about the governance that we think, about the novelty that we're willing to take, and so on and so forth. So you start realizing that this is a very big puzzle. And to just make that puzzle a bit more comprehensible and a bit easier to digest, I think the research has very early on focused on categorizing two distinctive versions of innovation. And I'm doing the typology sort of discussion here at that stage, because it's going to be useful later on as we're trying to create this how-to map that I have promised to you that we're going to be delivering. Now, what's the logic behind this? The logic is that there is a set of economic factors that in the end of the day, we make choices upon: which markets, what type of features on the product, the process that we use in order to develop the innovation, the pricing that we undertake. All those different factors will define a performance for the innovation that we're trying to sort of bring forward, right? And there is proximity of those factors to factors that we understand very well because we've done it in the past and they're embedded in our current offering. So we use similar pricing models, we use similar materials, we use similar supply chains, we use similar features in our products. We make very small changes from a design standpoint, and that you would call an incremental sort of innovation, as I'm trying to depict in a little graph in here. And on the other hand, we will have a big departure of the factors from the current values that they have, from the current choices that we've made. And essentially, this will imply much higher risk and potentially much higher performance, but that higher risk does not necessarily guarantee the performance. And we're finding ourselves into the realm of the radical innovation. So we'll use this basic typology. Obviously, somebody can now slice down that spectrum much more, but this basic typology is sufficient to indicate that the work that we've done and the literature that exists out there already is pointing to different directions for how we think on treating that innovation. Now, that typology is not new, in the sense that we have seen similar, worded differently, but similar tensions being highlighted in the literature. For example, the exploration versus exploitation dilemma that March has put forward, exploration mapping to radical, exploitation mapping to incremental, as I described it before, or the disruptive versus sustaining innovation. Again, so disruptive is usually radical, something we haven't thought, something completely new. Sustaining is an innovation that builds on the previous one. The competence enhancing or competence destroying innovation, coming from Tushman and Anderson in their seminal article in 1986, or also the architectural versus component innovation by Henderson and Clark, who really are thinking about the holistic change. So many factors changing, many things being altered, if you think, versus something much more specific, much more component oriented. All this are painting this dimension of something radically novel, something radically incremental. So the question is, how can we actually pursue innovations of those types? Now, the key question for an operations community like ourselves is going beyond simply creating the typology. The typology is just an interesting vehicle for categorizing our thinking, in a sense. I think the interesting discussion starts becoming, how should we actually address those issues differently from that standpoint? And that's where we will go into presenting the framework that I promised you in innovation, and then which is going to be generic in terms of both of those types of innovation, but then it's going to be the differential mechanisms within the elements of the framework that really highlight the two different types of innovation. So very quickly, the framework is not earth-shattering in the sense that it's going to tell you something that you've never thought about, but I think it puts together very successfully, very succinctly, some key ideas about innovation. So in order to have any type of innovation happening, at some point we need to realize and we need to sort of accept the fact that there is three key blocks of activities, as I would call them, that need to happen, three key phases that any innovation project, any innovation effort, any innovation system will have to cater to. The first one is ideation. At some level, we cannot have innovation without new ideas sparked about an existing problem challenge, or sometimes new ideas even without phrasing explicitly the challenge, right? Discoveries, in a sense. So there has to be a set of mechanisms, a set of rules that promote those new ideas. Now, the second element is this notion of selection. We have to have a process, a structure, rules organizationally for actually having those many ideas potentially and selecting the ones that are fitting much more what we aim to achieve. Hence, business strategy starts becoming important. And not only what we aim to achieve, but what we can achieve, which means that internal capabilities start becoming important, but also all the outside inputs about what the competition does and how the technology is evolving and whom are we working with to deliver that value. So the broader ecosystem and supply chain that we have, how those are enabling us to think about the selection. And through that selection, potentially promote the right, and the right becomes a very vague term here, ideas, that then we will need to take through a process that will take them from that idea level into an actual offering, an actual scalable, implementable, value creating, and economically usefulness generating, let's say, outcome. Now, there's different processes here, and I'm just depicting a couple of them here. We're going to talk about that as we go forward, but this is the execution phase, right? So this ideation, selection, execution phase starts becoming important. Now, interestingly enough, not even this triad is staying fixed over time, but as we are ideating, as we're selecting, as we innovate, and we see how well we perform, we might learn a bit more about how to ideate better and how to select much more efficiently or effectively, or how to execute much more effectively. So we build the capabilities that then those are feeding back into the business strategy and the organization adapting themselves, which is a broader evolutionary cycle, if somebody would like to see it as such, on how even our innovation systems and processes are evolving. But for the moment, we're going to sort of leave that aside and focus much more on the three in terms of the discussion that we're going to be having. So that's not a complete new perspective. So we didn't invent the wheel in a sense here and really trying to sell you that wheel. But what we're trying to sort of do is put together thoughts that have been scattered in terms of being developed from different frameworks. So in a sense, stepping on the shoulders of previous giants to be able to sort of drive what we're trying to sort of discuss. The original one that I need to pay special tribute to is Jim Utterbach and his early discussions in the 70s, where he really talked about these different phases. And from then on, several others, both from the organizational side, like Brown and Eisenhardt, as well as from our community, like Vish Krishnan and Christoph Locke, and Carl Ulrich have really put together a set of studies that have been looking in the past literature, trying to understand how we categorize and how we think about this literature in a cohesive framework. And many of the aspects that you see here are highlighted as key decisions, as key phases there. So really what we're putting together is sort of not a synopsis, but a synthesis of all those different studies that you've seen in the past. Now, there's two interesting things that stem directly from this framework. The first one is the immediate understanding that the outcome of innovation, the value that's coming out of innovation, cannot be viewed as an additive or a substitutable sort of performance. And what do I mean by this? So we can't substitute bad ideas for good selection, in a sense. Instead, we need to understand that the value is coming from the complementarity of all those. So if we generate effectively many and good ideas, and we have a great process by matching those ideas to where we want to achieve, so we make good selection, and then we know how the process is going to take them forward, then is when we maximize. So just to put it in the right audience, I assume, right, from the standpoint of a little formula here, the outcome value of innovation is not additive, it's multiplicative. And I think that's an important element. Now, the immediate managerial lesson, if you wish, coming out of this discussion is nothing else than the obvious fact that as a manager, you can't really invest on only one of those sides. You need to be thinking about your system holistically, right? And that's not a negligible message to sort of give out there. Now, the second thing is that this can be viewed, and I've done that, and I've even developed a little questionnaire with a couple of colleagues here at the Jazz Business School, which unfortunately we didn't share within the chapter, but I would be happy to share with anyone who might have an interest in that. We developed a little questionnaire, which was a small diagnostic that really takes people's mind away from this very holistic and very complex and very compounded version of what innovation is, and takes them a bit more deeply into the three key dimensions, so that they can start at least breaking apart the beast, if you would like to call it like this, of innovation and management of innovation, and start looking into the distinctive elements of that. For example, do we have really issues of coming up with new ideas? And are all our new ideas the same? And we don't tend to go further away from the ideas that we had in the past. Interesting. Why is this happening, right? Or do we do have interesting ideas, but somehow it always tends to be the case that we err towards the more conservative ideas. So our selection process is not allowing for taking a bit more risk. Why is this the case? Or even in the execution phase, we start with the ideas, but all the great ambitious ideas that we have and we've selected, we said we want to support them, eventually end up dying and not really performing well. Why would this be the case? There's reasons and answers to all of those things, and there's a rich literature behind that, and I'm coming to that in just a second. But it's important from a diagnostic standpoint to look at the picture and start asking the question of where is the biggest challenge with innovation, and that can be phrased into questions, as I said, as we're sort of looking forward. So, what has the literature said with respect to all this? A lot is the quick answer, but and be prepared for a set of slides, and I sort of apologize this in advance, that will have a lot of papers cited, but the idea is to sort of categorize them in some key taglines that will give you at least an inspiration to take the next step towards looking much deeply in some of those references if you're interested in particular aspects of the problem. Again, I'll have to say that I'm not going to do justice to all the papers that we even cite in the chapter. There's a good 250 papers that are cited in that particular chapter. And I'm already picking some of them as I'm going through this little presentation. And even for those ones, I cannot discuss them all because there's a natural limit in terms of time, but hopefully they will give you a sense of some of the key references, with the usual caveat of the biases of being the author of the chapter, right? So let me start with the issue of ideation. Okay. So what is in ideation some of the interesting problems that we've looked at and that we have decided to sort of try to understand a bit more, and what are some of the results that came about? There's two broad categories. So I'll spend a couple of slides on this, and there's two broad categories that ideation has actually contributed to. One is ideation and coming up with ideas within an existing organization, right? So how can the people in the organization brainstorm more effectively and come up with ideas much more effectively, let's say. And then there's a second category which has emerged over the last, I would say, 10 years really within our community, and a little bit more if you look at earlier versions of analysis in economics, which has been looking at this broader notion of open innovation, or how do we really turn innovation and the ideation component of innovation into a crowd activity, this notion of crowdsourcing of ideas. Let me start with the first one. And I think there is three main aspects that have been sort of really worked upon a lot by some of the literature. The first one is the role of the idea pool, right? So the notion that depending on where you fish, you will get the equivalent fish being caught, right? And that's an interesting perspective because it tries to connect very effectively, I would say, the distribution of ideas, and the dispersion of ideas, the structure of the landscape of ideas back into the best idea. What is really the best idea we could get on expectation? Now, as you can guess, this tries to account for the size of the pool, the diversity, which is an important element, and the complexity in terms of structure, the interdependence between those ideas. And what you see here is a few of the key papers, starting with Dahan and Mendelssohn, who try to sort of do this early study on how different distributions, let's say, of the original landscape of ideas would determine the through maximal statistics would determine the extreme statistics would determine what the expectation of the best idea is, and people are building upon that, and also both Fleming and Sorensen, by taking this notion of a landscape, complex landscape together, but also Laura Cornish and Carl Ulrich have looked in detail in terms of how big is that space, and how we can sort of maximize the ideas. Adding to that later work by Sanjeev Arat, and really trying to understand how this process of making ideas better as we search through the ideas also takes advantage of the pool. The second thing is the role of incentives. And despite the fact that somebody would expect this to be an important element, so what kind of carrot do I give to a group of people that try to come up with ideas? There hasn't been as much work on this. So how do we incentivize groups of people to generate ideas? There's a lot of work on the psychology, social psychology side, which I'll come to talk about this in just a bullet point in a sense. But from the standpoint of incentives, economic incentives, I can distinguish the work of Olivier Tubia from marketing early on, and then some subsequent experimental work by Rat and Grisi, which point to the idea that we need to be thinking about the process incentives, and how we actually give people incentives to follow the right process in terms of keeping the diversity, in terms of not trying to block each other, in terms of not really focusing too early and framing things, as opposed to output incentives, because the output is not known and output incentives would not work in this context. Last but not least, much richer literature comes in from the organizational structure that we are observing in this particular cases. And in particular, the fact that the myth of the lone inventor versus the team has been very central, I would say, in that discussion. Now, interestingly enough, certain studies bring also the problem complexity, like my work with Svenja Sommer has done earlier on in management science. But there seems to be a very interesting, concrete way of building, starting with Singh and Fleming, to some of the work that recently Tian Chan with Jürgen Mim and Manuel Sosa have published, that really speaks to this notion of when is it better to have individuals searching or thinking or ideating for this best solution, as opposed to having groups of people doing that. Interestingly enough, something that starts emerging, which will link back to the typology that we had, is that when we start looking at more holistic, more complex, less understood spaces, if you wish, then surprisingly individuals perform better in terms of ideating, as opposed to teams that are supposed to bring different sort of different inputs and viewpoints together. It's interesting here to note the fact that the as we're talking, the fact that the literature on this particular aspect in terms of the ideation and the brainstorming echoes earlier findings from the social psychology in terms of for the myth, let's say, of the team stops at some point, and it stops usually when we're talking about complete complex problems. So that's the internal part. The external part, this notion of innovation tournaments, that goes back into an earlier work by Christian Tervish and Yizhu, bringing it in that community. There's much earlier work by Taylor and a few other economists in tournaments in general. Tries to look at, as I said, that's the outside phenomenon. Three things come interesting here, and this is much more recent work. The role of the size of the solver pool, right? So you know, the average capability out there, and what the average capability is, and how do people think about that. There's a fundamental story here to understand that the bigger the size of the pool, the more competitive the pool becomes. So the average effort decreases, but the bigger the size of the pool, the more the stochastic effect might play in our favor, people thinking about an idea that nobody else could think. So from extreme statistics, the expected maximum would go up. Those two things sort of counteract. And an interesting study by Kevin Boudreau and co-authors has sort of really claimed a bit that the incentive effect, the effort effect, is dominating versus the effect of finding the best possible solution out there. Nevertheless, there's been a discussion on this. Then there is a big discussion about the role of the award structure, with some of the work that Ersin Korpeoglu and Suhang Cho have performed, and more recent papers along these lines. It seems that the single award dominates usually, the winner takes all in all those cases, but there are conditions, and that's part of the work that Ersin has done, that identify when we do not see a single award, but we can benefit from multiple awards, which relate on the structure of the marginal effort, and how you know, the marginal effort that we put for finding a solution, how easy or difficult is it to translate some kind of differentiation. So the easier it is, in a sense, the closer those marginal efforts are, the more we might want to be using some multiple awards. Finally, the role of the structure of the tournament in terms of, do I give you a problem and people go out and solve it? Do I give you feedback in between? Started recently becoming of interest in terms of how are we running this. An interesting study here recently is the role of the feedback, both from a normative, a modeling, but also from an empirical standpoint. Jürgen Mihm and Jochen Schlapp on the modeling side, and Joel Wooten and Carl Ulrich on the empirical side, looking at how the feedback on those tournaments is bettering or not the solutions that we see, and what type of feedback actually. The interesting thing is that we start seeing not only modeling work emerging, but also empirical and experimental work emerging. And actually, in that particular space, experimental work has not been as, because of the availability of the data, I would assume, but it hasn't been as pronounced as one would expect. But maybe there is great opportunities here. Moving into the selection, where essentially selecting the right ideas has two interesting issues, right? The first one is finding that right idea, finding those right ideas. So there is one part of the literature that's aimed really to identify the right ideas. Can we really put structures and decision models and theoretical models together to determine the right ideas, given that we have a certain type of idea? All this goes back to this earlier story of the knapsack problem. And the second part, which I'm going to be showing you in the next slide, is the question of, maybe we can't guarantee that we can find the right idea, which relates a bit to the discussion that we had on the ideation side. But what we can guarantee is whether we will have the right incentive mechanisms and structural decision mechanisms in place, so that we will not lose good ideas that might show up, or we will not keep investing in wrong ideas and bad ideas as we will move forward. These are two different. So one of them is the outcome of the process versus the other one being the process. In the outcome of the process, I don't have that much to say here, because the literature is humongous in a sense. I mean, there's conferences that talk about the knapsack problem. There is books that have been written about the knapsack problem and versions of the knapsack problem. So really trying to sort of review that literature would be not useless, but not adding to our conversation today. it's my duty to point you to that literature and say that there is some part of the literature that has tried to go around with the rule of the marginal benefit. Part of that is my early work out of my dissertation, but that message has not changed drastically. Let's put it like this. I mean, I think it's been kind of structured. Now, there is a part of that literature that actually believes that certain tools and certain methods, hierarchical planning or strategic buckets, or a few of the methods that also come from consulting, could be used that eventually will push the team to recognize the right ideas. But there's also a part of that latter literature, the more practitioner-oriented literature, that sort of accepts the fact that maybe it's impossible to guarantee that we will find the best possible ideas. There's no optimal set of ideas, let's put it like this, given a set of opportunities, because things depend drastically on the contingencies and on the companies, on the organizational realities that we're looking at. And that's what's point us to maybe we should switch gears and start looking much more into the aspect that speaks on the managing that selection process, on structuring and managing that selection process, which goes back to the early discussions on resource allocation by Bauer from Harvard in the 1980s, in a great book that he has written, where he's trying to understand why certain decisions of selection and resource allocation are happening in organizations, finding out that there is certain signals that will always define and shape those decisions. For example, the effect of competition. Does more competitive interactions and environments lead to more incremental or more radical innovation, for example? I guess you can guess the obvious answer, right? More competition makes us go smaller steps and more incremental innovation. And that might be a big issue, let's say. Although some of the recent work that has happened, motivated by the pharma industry, indicates that there is an interesting tension between followership, which means incremental innovation and building on the successes of the others in a race, an ongoing race out there for introducing new products, versus actually diversifying and moving away from everybody else and trying to do something radically different and new, and the conditions that are there. So that's one part of the literature, right, that looks at this. And it has deep roots also in economics, as I said, sort of. The second one is the resource rules and availabilities. And I'm putting that in broad terms by indicating that depending on what rules do we impose on allocating the resources and making selection, we might have better or worse performances. So an interesting insight that comes, again, motivated a bit through the pharmaceutical industry, but a little bit beyond that as well in terms of the design industry, is the fact that because of the uncertainty that comes forward in execution in subsequent stages of this innovation sort of process, the capacity that's allocated might benefit from either being a bit more increased to accommodate for the fact that there will be stochasticities in terms of the demand of resources over time, or it has to be expanded by some of the ideas not being killed by being kept, like the work by Karan Girotra, Christian Terwiesch, and Carl Ulrich indicated early on in 2007 in terms of pharmaceutical portfolios, because when something fails, then we have a quick replacement and the pipeline keeps delivering value, or by being split extremely clearly between two different beasts to be dealing with. Things that we understand and they can generate value in systematic ways very quickly, and we dedicate part of our resources there, and then a bucket that is dedicated for much longer term. This notion of strategic buckets that I've worked with Raoul Chow from Darden on those aspects early on his thesis. Last but not least, the effect of incentives, right, and decision structures. And here what we see is an interesting avenue for work, and I think there is still quite some interesting discussion there, which would link much more into what type of incentives would promote the pursuing of more risky or less risky ideas, and to what extent organizations can think about those incentives combined with the decision rights. Should the top define what is being sort of pursued, or should we allow the experts and the scientists and the engineers at the bench sort of decide what the right idea is by having some kind of a delegated, by being authority being empowered to pursue those ideas. And that creates an interesting discussion about what I would call the feasibility set of ideas. So how many of those ideas that might be presenting in front of us could we pursue? It's great that we can generate them, but maybe we cannot pursue them because the risk considerations from then on are going to kick in. And that's an interesting set of studies as well, as I said. Last but not least, the execution component. In the execution component, we come forward with, I would say, three key things, right? The first thing is incremental innovation, much more of a waterfall stage gate approach, where we really have a lot of discussions on optimal go, no-go decisions, real option kind of structures, where we try to understand how different types of uncertainty potentially should make us stop or continue. It's an optimal stopping discussion. Behavioral elements of this. So there's the optimal version of when should I stop, but then there's other biases that decision makers have that would prevent them from stopping. And this way we observe phenomena like escalation of commitment, and we keep throwing money into a project that seems to be going bad in terms of performance and so on and so forth. There's an interesting, very interesting amount of work that's been developed recently, the latest edition being the paper by Long and co-authors in management science along these lines. An interesting experimental part of work as well. And last but not least, there is the understanding that those development projects, those let's say stage gate structures, are not single individuals. There are multiple parties that need to be working with each other in there. And the question is, how do we create the contractual structures that will support those efforts going forward, and then how do we share the benefits? Some of the work of Pascal Krama here or Sri Bhaskaran has been early on driving this, and this is a consistent editing type of work. So really looking at those contractual structures. That's the first part, and both this part and some of the older or more classic, if you wish, literature on that topic comes to address the issue. And that's the information exchange and communication in a waterfall process. And this really is the origins. I would claim that this is the origins of our sort of operations product development community, with the early works of Vish Krishnan, Christian Tervis, Christoph Loch, in that domain, and as well as Steve Empinger and the design structure matrix, which allowed to see what are the effects of the interconnections and the dependencies, the interfaces between different parts of the design in terms of the performance of the project. So again, that I would add that more classic literature, as I said, in that early stage gate phenomenon. The second, which is incremental oriented, right? The second is the experimentation phenomenon, which is much more the radical innovation. And that goes to the earlier works of Stefan Tomke, and to a core set of studies that has happened within our community in terms of understanding how to search in imperfect, with imperfect information in landscapes of solutions. So should we actually try things, and which direction should we try things in order to find them? Understanding what type of thresholds we could identify in terms of performance of the solutions that we find, so that we can continue or stop, and understanding also that depending now on the dependencies between the solutions, depending on the structure of the landscape, some of those thresholds could be positive, some of those thresholds could be lower and upper thresholds. So we create some kind of a band of thresholds there. Last but not least, iterations are not only happening due to search, which is what we aim for, but also due to coordination. Very interesting part of the literature that started with early works of Nitin Joglekar and Jürgen Mim on his thesis, and has moved even to today with the latest edition coming from Javad Nasiri and Jafari on how we can think about those oscillations happening, and how do we manage those, how do we dampen those oscillations in terms of different functions interacting during the project development back and forth, by trying to find the common joint optimum in the presence of individual optima that are different than the joint. I mean, that's really the core idea behind all this discussion. And there is also interesting empirical literature, Manuel Sosa and Bilal Gokbinar on this. Okay, that sort of brings us to a closure in the last few minutes that I have. It would be almost impossible to run you through the slides that you see here, but this is looking back at all the literature that I very quickly glanced through. It's very rich, as I said, and trying to see what do we know about how to do incremental innovation or how to do radical innovation. You will start seeing that from a planning and process, from monitoring, from performance metrics, from or coordination, communication, as well as even from a leadership standpoint, there is two distinctive discussions to be had, right? Which point to the direction of more focus, more efficiency, more output measurement and output incentives, more efficient communication structures top down, not as much empowerment, stronger hierarchies, and much more command and control systems coming on the incremental innovation. Whereas in the radical innovation, we are treating a much more open, vision oriented, less hierarchical, more flat, if you wish, with an idea of incubating the ideas as opposed to really selecting them. So being a bit more flexible on whether we fund ideas, potentially we fund more ideas with less money to try them out, and then we become much harsher once we understand those ideas later on, once the radicalness of the innovation has moved away. More process-oriented metrics, more team, group, shared metrics are becoming relevant in the radical innovation side. More flat, as I said, communication structures and communication structures that enable as much connectivity as possible from a social network standpoint, given the works that we've seen earlier on, and leaders that are much more of team motivators, synthesizers of inputs, sort of the typical entrepreneur who knows how to solve any type of problem, but is not an expert necessarily on this problem, because they know how to iterate fast, they know how to fail fast, they know how to really motivate the troops to take the plunge and the extra step. So again, I would suggest that the chapter is a much better source of detailed discussion on this. I would need an hour by itself to explain how we can think about this individual sort of columns, but I wanted to make sure that I present them to you and I give you a sense that we have, through the literature, understood a lot. We can give a lot of advice, in a sense, both on the incremental innovation and on the radical innovation. Now, what's left, and this is my last slide as I'm delivering this virtual presentation, highly subjective, as you would expect. The discussion is on the ideation side is much more on the definition of the problem. If I had an hour, I should spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes about solving it. So how do we structure the problem? Unlocking the creativity more from a procedural standpoint. So understanding that creativity is depending on associations that brains do, and there's a way by which we can train people to create those associations. So a problem that's seems completely relevant might have elements that we can bring into the current problem that we have. Recent work has started looking into designing new service, and that's a topic that I'm personally very much interested in. And I think we can bridge the gap with traditional operation services sort of management a lot in here in terms of how we design services, given that we understand well how the execution of services go. In terms of the selection, a lot of behavioral biases, a lot of experimental work I think should be done. I've started sort of myself doing some work like this, but I think it's an endless discussion. And also we need to actually finally take those models and abstracts and the likes and really try seeing what happens inside the organization. So empirical validation of some of those portfolio rules. Another element that I think is important that I've experienced through the Entrepreneurship Center is how do we select ideas very early on when the ROI is not even relevant, is not even quantifiable. Same thing happens in pharmaceutical companies in the discovery phase, and still people need to make selections. So how do we do that in those instances? And finally, in the execution level, a lot of new work will happen, and I think should happen in the business models. This is how the competition has moved recently, right? Developing these new business models in the digital world that we're in. The multi-stakeholder complex project is still something that we do less. There is work, and I've indicated part of that work, like Manuel Sosa and Jürgen Mim and Nitin Joglekar, the coordination and the iterations there. But I think all this work treats the stakeholders as constraints, and the stakeholders are not only constraints, they're also, I would say, ideators, co-ideators. Finally, continuation, stopping and radical and pivoting in radical projects, pivoting primarily. How do we understand how to pivot, right? So with that, I would like to stop at the 60 minutes. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be looking for your questions once we move into the actual virtual live session. Thank you very much.